Welcome to today's Explainer. We usually think of measuring a system as kind of like looking through a window. We assume we're just observing what's happening without actually participating in it. But what if the very act of looking fundamentally changes the room? Today, we're exploring a seriously powerful systems thinking concept. Observation is not passive. Across geopolitics, economics, artificial intelligence, and digital infrastructure, what we can observe depends heavily on how the system itself reacts to being observed. By the end of this explainer, you're going to look at every dashboard, every metric, and every single data point in a completely different way. To really wrap our heads around this, we need to look at two perfectly opposite events happening right now. First, consider a total solar eclipse over Europe. This is a beautifully passive, perfectly predictable disturbance. We know exactly where it'll occur, when it starts, how it moves, and exactly when it ends. Britain's grid operator initially requested extra generating capacity to cover the expected loss of solar power, but they were actually able to cancel that request. They just updated their observations, recalculated their exposure, and realized the intervention simply wasn't needed. That's exactly how safety systems should work. But in stark contrast, look at the Strait of Hormuz. In these highly dangerous waters, ships are intentionally turning off their automatic identification system, or AIS transponders. Before the conflict, we'd see roughly 130 to 140 vessels tracked per day. Now, sometimes it's literally as low as 8. Okay, let's dive into this, because this introduces our first major concept: observability withdrawal. The ships in the Strait of Hormuz aren't disappearing because the tracking sensors are suddenly broken. They're actively switching off their AIS because broadcasting their location makes them easier to target. Being observed creates a direct physical risk. So the shipping system becomes less observable precisely when it becomes more dangerous. Analysts lose their telemetry exactly when they need it the absolute most, and they're forced to compensate by piecing together totally fragmented data, stuff like satellite imagery, radar, insurance records, and inferred tracks. We have to start asking a completely different question. What can we infer from the deliberate decision not to be seen? Let's see how this plays out in a completely different arena. Let's talk macroeconomics. Recently, we saw a U.S. inflation report for July showing inflation cooling off, which lined up with a surprising decline in July payrolls. Now, that benign data makes you think, okay, the Federal Reserve might just hold interest rates steady. But here's the wrinkle. That July inflation data largely predates a massive August surge in Middle Eastern energy prices, with Brent crude pushing near $89 a barrel due to supply concerns. The Fed is trying to steer the entire economy, but their sensors update at vastly different speeds. Employment weakened in July. Inflation was benign in July, but oil is surging in August, and any monetary policy action they actually take won't take full effect for months. This disconnect is what we call evidence latency. It's the delay between a system actually changing its underlying state and reliable evidence of that change finally reaching the people who need to make decisions. You could almost think of it as observation decay. That inflation report, it describes a past state. It's essentially a ghost of the economy from weeks ago, while the oil shock is already actively rewriting the future. And the crazy thing is, none of these data points are necessarily contradictory. They're simply observing different pieces of the system at totally different times. And speaking of that oil shock, consider the feedback loop it creates. The International Energy Agency recently cut its global oil supply forecast, expecting a massive deficit. But they also lowered their demand expectations at the same time. Why? Because the high prices themselves are actually suppressing consumption. So the crucial takeaway here is that high prices in Hormuz are no longer merely an output of the shortage. They've become a critical part of the control loop itself. Constrained supply leads to higher prices, which reduces demand, which then leads to a less severe shortage. The market is essentially performing load shedding. Now, it's incredibly painful for consumers for sure, but mechanically, it's a system balancing itself out. This brilliantly illustrates how systems hide their true complexity from our standard ways of observing them. Take a look at this. When Ukraine launched a major drone and missile attack on Novorossiysk, a major Russian Black Sea port, the immediate headline was just about the disabling of 2 grain terminals. The map just says port, and our standard observation tools look at it as a single point of geographic interest. But the reality of what was actually disrupted is vastly more complicated than a single dot on a map. The dependency graph for that single geographical node tells a completely different story. Novorossiysk doesn't just support grain exports, it supports naval operations. The attack disrupted local water infrastructure, logistics, rail connections, workers, massive storage facilities, and even complex shipping insurance markets. It's like a giant puzzle. When you destroy one interface in a complex system, the disruption propagates across entirely different systems whose diagrams were probably drawn in completely separate rooms. It's a perfect example of how our observations, like drawing a dot on a map, often totally fail to capture the reality of interconnected systems under stress. We actually see this exact same shift in how we observe digital systems, too. Right now, Meta is facing a massive U.S. courtroom test brought by 29 states accusing them of designing platforms to addict children. And what's fascinating here is how the legal focus is shifting. It's extending way beyond the simple observation of just harmful content. It's looking at the product architecture, notifications, engagement loops, and recommendation design. The courts are no longer just asking, what did the teenager see? They're asking a much richer systems question. What relationship did the system encourage the teenager to build with the system itself? The system's design is the observation we now actually care about. Just like observation changes digital behavior, policy changes physical behavior, often in ways that obscure our visibility. Take the grounding with the tanker Caroline Bezenji, which created a 400 square kilometer Russian oil spill off the coast of Oman. This tanker is part of a loosely regulated, opaque shadow fleet used to move sanctioned Russian oil. Now, to be clear, sanctions didn't directly cause the spill, but sanctions do create adaptations. The logistics naturally shift to older ships, hidden ownership structures, and shifting registries that are explicitly designed to be harder to monitor. The workaround itself eventually becomes its own deeply established system. And any policy that alters logistics also fundamentally alters the risk distribution of those new logistics. Governments are actually starting to realize this, and they're changing how they regulate based on how systems naturally optimize themselves. Look at Australia. They're introducing legislation requiring major digital platforms to pay domestic news organizations. But they aren't just saying, you must publish news or you must pay this specific publisher. They are creating an incentive architecture. They're applying a levy based on ad revenue, but they're letting platforms offset that cost if they create qualifying relationships with publishers. They're trying to make the desired behavior cheaper than the alternative. But as always with systems, whether this actually works will depend entirely on what the platforms choose to optimize once they fully understand the new metric. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it highlights a fascinating concept: being systemically premature. Nigeria recently approved tax waivers for thousands of electric vehicles and wants EVs to represent 60% of their vehicles by 2050. That sounds absolutely fantastic on paper, right? But here is the catch. They currently have fewer than 50 public charging stations and a national electricity grid that supplies roughly 4,000 megawatts to a population of over 200 million people. Because of this massive gap, some EV charging actually ends up depending on local diesel generators. Let's break down exactly why this happens. Electrifying a vehicle does not automatically electrify the entire transportation system. To make the whole shebang work, you need generation, which feeds transmission, which goes to distribution, into a charger, and finally to the vehicle. If you only change the vehicle box at the very end of that chain, the missing infrastructure doesn't just magically vanish. It simply reappears upstream in the form of a diesel generator. It is a powerful reminder that a solution can be technically correct, but systemically premature if you haven't bothered to observe the entire supply chain. This need for comprehensive, systemic observation is so urgently needed in artificial intelligence right now. We've been completely obsessed with simple leaderboards, treating AI evaluation like we're chasing a high score in an arcade game. But the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, has quietly released a much-needed reality check with their new TEV Athlon framework for evaluating AI systems. NIST is pushing us away from these universal, one-size-fits-all benchmarks and moving us toward genuine AI literacy at the organizational level. The NIST framework assumes that useful evaluations absolutely must be deeply customized. We can't just say Model X scored a 94 anymore. We have to ask, which specific system, under which exact configuration, performing what specific task, against what defined risk, and under which operating conditions? Now, I know, it's far less glamorous than a flashy leaderboard, but it forces organizations to ask the ultimate question. What does this specific test results actually give us permission to believe? So, the crucial point here is that as AI systems become more and more capable as agents, our security approaches need a major reality check too. NIST's work highlights that while we definitely need to adapt for AI, traditional cybersecurity principles are still intensely relevant. We still need to monitor authentication, deployment boundaries, and the surrounding network environment. Think about it. Recent high-profile AI incidents haven't just been about the model misbehaving internally. They've involved the surrounding network configuration and the monitoring architecture. Sometimes the solution isn't inventing a brand new kind of AI safety engineering. Sometimes we just need to remember to thoroughly do the old kind. Let's apply this kind of rigorous reality check to a major societal panic happening right now. The International Labor Organization recently reported that global youth unemployment has risen to 12.4%. Almost immediately, people started pointing fingers directly at artificial intelligence. But look closer at the data. 6.1%, according to the exact same report, that is the percentage of jobs for people aged 15 to 29 that are actually exposed to AI. We have to be incredibly careful not to oversell an unproven causal chain. Now, the ILO does note that sluggish economic growth and weak job creation are huge factors here. But let's look at the systemic risk that actually is worth worrying about regarding AI and jobs. Entry-level jobs perform two vital functions. Yes, they produce work, but they also serve as a school. They train inexperienced people into experienced people. If AI automates away those specific junior roles, the long-term crisis might not just be unemployment. It could become a severe shortage of people who ever acquire the intermediate experience required to become senior practitioners. We're looking at a potential human capital pipeline problem, not just a simple labor-saving problem. And speaking of pipelines, let's look at the financial pipeline driving AI. Bank of America recently announced a massive $250 billion financing initiative for AI infrastructure. This brings us to a really vital term, capitalized assumption. This is when an expectation about future demand is converted into a durable financial or physical commitment, like building a massive data center. Financing is a powerful feedback loop. Available money builds data centers, which lowers compute constraints, which breeds more AI apps, which drives more expected demand. But remember, feedback loops can run backward. If models change their architecture or electricity just gets too expensive, those massive financial commitments can disastrously outlive the assumptions that created them in the first place.
Okay, let's take a breath for a second and look at something a bit lighter, but honestly incredibly profound. Singapore seniors are doing parkour. No, seriously, you read that correctly. A program in Singapore is actually teaching older adults adapted parkour techniques. Now, they aren't out there jumping across skyscrapers. They're learning agility, balance, and most importantly, how to safely absorb the impact of a fall.
This is the ultimate lesson in systemic resilience, and we call it graceful failure capacity. You simply cannot engineer a physical body, an organization, a power grid, or an AI agent where failure is totally impossible. You can't build a world where nobody falls. But you can improve the system's ability to enter a controlled, degraded state when things go wrong, rather than suffering a complete, catastrophic collapse. The goal isn't to magically prevent every failure. The goal is to carefully design the state the system enters when failure inevitably occurs. Which brings us to our final overarching question for this explainer. From ships vanishing off trackers in the Middle East, to delayed inflation data, to AI benchmarks that just don't tell the whole story, we have to ask ourselves, which signal do we trust most? And what happens to that specific signal when the system is under the exact stress we actually care about? Because if the answer is the signal vanishes precisely when things get dangerous, well, that's not just a broken instrument. That is a fundamental part of the system's design, and it's on us to understand it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helps you look at the systems around you with a much sharper eye. See you next time.